Marvelous, thank you. Okay, everyone. So it's great to see so many of you here today. My name's Georgia Mason. I'm director of the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks very much to our speaker. It's wonderful to see you all. And I'd also like to acknowledge with gratitude that the Campbell Centre and the University of Guelph reside on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The land was first purchased from this nation by the British in 1784 in a deal that history tells us was probably shady. So grateful respect and acknowledgement there. It's also wonderful to welcome Steph Torrey, who for a very long time has been an active and really valued member of the group here. And indeed, she's still an adjunct faculty member in animal biosciences. Dr. Torrey is an expert on poultry and swine welfare. She's authored and co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications, and her work and expertise has informed policy and auditing schemes around farm animal welfare, genetics and transportation, and euthanasia. And she's currently a research scientist with Trouw Nutrition, leading a global team that's validating nutritional products for poultry production, health and welfare. And she was just telling us earlier how this means some, because her team is really all over the world. She's often having meetings at 5:30 in the morning just to make things work. Steph,
I'm part of the team. I'm not leading the team. I'm a member of the team. Yes.
Okay, all right. Sorry,
That's okay.
Okay, I'm sure you will be. Okay, so Steph is American. She's a native of Massachusetts. She did her PhD here in Guelph. She was then a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, first based in Quebec, then seconded back here in Ontario. And then she became a research associate in the Campbell Centre on the huge grant and the huge project she's going to talk to us about today. So her topic's really important because globally, 70 million broiler or meat chickens are raised each year. So that's pretty much 10 times the number of humans on the planet. And more than 90% of them grow at a phenomenal rate. They reach market weight at just 6 weeks or so when they're really babies. So is this accelerated growth a problem? So in this seminar, Steph's going to tackle this topic and discuss the welfare of broiler chickens and whether a transition to a slower growing genetic stock would have a measurable effect on their welfare. Thanks so much, Steph.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Georgia. It's great to see a number of familiar names in the participant list and some new names. And I hope that we can have some good discussions at the end of this if you have any additional questions. My email address is here. As Georgia said, I'm at Trouw Nutrition in Puslinch as part of the global validation team. Okay. So while I'm the only one presenting today, it was really these scientists that did the work for this study. We're really fortunate to have an amazing team of people, including Dr. Lauren Dawson, the now Dr. Midian Nascimento dos Santos, Dr. Mohsen Mohammadi Geyser, Daniel Rothschild, Zhenzhen Liu, and not pictured are Dr. Aitor Arzola and Lucas Silly. So the chicken that you find in the grocery store or at the restaurants and such is incredibly homogeneous. So all the breasts are the same large size. You go and buy a package of breasts to cook and they'll all be approximately the same size. Go to KFC and all the fried chicken pieces will be about the same size. And that's because 90% of the chicken that's available at the grocery stores and in restaurants is from a conventional broiler chicken, which is a White Rock and Cornish chickens. And broiler chickens have changed really significantly over the last 60 years, with most of those changes coming in the last 40 or so years. In the early 1980s, Tyson Foods realized that breasts were worth more than other parts of the chicken. And so they called for more meat and less bones on chickens. And indeed, in Canada, breasts are about 1.75 times that of thigh meat. So breeding companies certainly heeded the call and started breeding for greater breast yield. And you can see from this picture by Martin Sweetoff that it's been quite a dramatic change in the conformation of broiler chickens due to genetics. Now, along with larger breasts, broiler chickens are growing faster than ever before. So broiler chickens reach about 2.1 kilograms, so a light market weight, in about 5 weeks now. Whereas some 45 years ago, it took twice that amount of time. However, particularly in North America, chickens are being marketed at heavier body weights than that 2.1 kilogram. Chickens are sold predominantly for processed parts. So they're grown to an older age, about 6 or 7 weeks, and up to about 4 kilograms in body weight. And so while nutrition, veterinary medicine, management, and housing have all had some influence on that growth rate, most of the changes in production have come from genetic selection. But what does that mean for the bird? So broiler chickens are highly productive, but it comes at a cost to their welfare. And this table summarizes the results of 5 large epidemiological studies on predominantly on physical parameters, including things like mortality, foot pad dermatitis, hawk burns, and lameness. And so across these studies, they found mortality to be about on par with industry, so around 3.5%, which is generally the industry standard. And the prevalence of moderate to severe foot pad lesions, FPD here, ranged anywhere from 1.5 to 50% of the flocks of the birds. And moderate to severe lameness ranged from 15 to about 35%. Now, we know from published research that severe foot pad lesions and severe lameness are painful for broiler chickens. So while things have vastly improved over the last 20 to 30 years due to genetic companies incorporating some of these welfare traits into their selection schemes, there's still room for significant improvement. So that brings me to the question at hand on whether slower growth means better welfare. But what exactly is a slow growing broiler? Really, it depends on who you ask. Conventional broiler strains, the ones I mentioned earlier, will gain about 60 to 65 grams per day, which means they reach that 2.1 kilograms in about 35 days. Different countries have different labeling schemes that define what they feel a slow growing broiler is. So in France, the Label Rouge program stipulates that broilers have to be in production for at least 81 days. So that gives them a growth rate of 26 grams per day. RSPCA in the UK does not include any specific age or weight limit per se, but they do have to approve specific slow growing breeds for inclusion within their program. For use of the German Tierschutz label, broilers have to grow slower than 45 grams per day. And the Dutch Better Leven stipulates that they have to grow slower than 38 grams per day. And so really there is quite a bit of variation around the world, mostly requirements for slow growing broilers from Europe. However, Global Animal Partnership, or GAP, whose assurance program a number of food service companies and retailers have signed on to, had originally limited their growth rate to 50 grams per day, which would get about a 2.1 kilogram bird in about 42 days. But in around 2016, they walked that back because they felt like there wasn't enough research to have a hard cutoff in terms of growth rates. So they approached me and Tina Wadowski about doing this large research project to see if growth rate was indeed the driving factor in broiler welfare. But in order to compare broiler welfare, we have to have ways to measure it. And so I particularly like the framework described by David Fraser as those 3 circles for a starting point in looking at welfare. So for broilers, we would ask if they're healthy and disease-free and growing. Are they experiencing negative affective states such as pain, discomfort, hunger, thirst, frustration, or possibly experiencing positive states like pleasure? And are they able to perform motivated behavior? Over the last 5 years, there's been myriad studies on anywhere from 2 to 4 strains of broiler chickens in various environments. And pretty much all of these studies, the slower growing strains, had better welfare outcomes than the conventional strains. But there were often other factors at play, including free range use or differences in stocking density within the various studies. So in 2017, we started this project to benchmark data on the welfare of broiler chickens, taking into account their behavior, their health, production, physiology and anatomy, and carcass and meat quality. And we controlled for things like housing, feed, final ages and weights, stocking density, hatch conditions, and enrichment. I will acknowledge that while we controlled for those, that means that some of those conditions were not the ideal for particular strains. For example, we fed all of the strains in our study the same diet formulated for slower growth, which isn't the ideal diet for some of the strains. In our study, we used 3 conventional fast-growing strains. These strains had a estimated growth rate of 60 to 65 grams per day. And then we used 13 slower growing strains, and 12 of these strains had estimated growth rates from 43 to 55 grams per day. And we also had 1 mixed breed dual purpose group made up of heritage strains, and they grew at about 20 grams per day. And the strains were all housed in pens that were segregated by strain within 1 large room. And we aim to have four pens per strain per trial and house each of the strains in 3 trials over time. We ran 8 trials over the course of the 2 years. Here I have all the strains that we studied by their growth rate on the y-axis here. And this was their growth rate to a heavy body weight. We have the conventional strains on the left and the slower growing strains on the right. Now for 2 of the strains A and strain T, we did not have a large enough sample size for inclusion of those strains within our statistical analyses, so we didn't categorize them for comparisons. However, since science has shown us that a lot of the welfare problems co-vary with growth rate, we wanted to see if strains of similar growth rates or those with vastly different growth rates had similar or different welfare. And so we categorized the strains by their growth rates so that we could compare both the categories of strains and strains within categories. So we had 2 that were within the conventional category, and then we divided the remaining 12 strains into 3 separate categories, depending on their growth rate to the heavy body weight. Like I said, the study ran over a 2-year period, and that was to accommodate just the large number of strains and to accommodate each strain being in the study at a couple of different time points. And we collaborated with breeding companies for them to ship us the fertile eggs. We did this so that we could account for differences in incubation and hatch conditions and eliminate the transportation and major handling on the day of hatch. And so all of the strains were housed in the same environmentally controlled room over time, of course. They didn't have any outdoor access. Each pen had the same features. So there's a raised platform in the back here, a mineral peck stone. A bird is actually sitting on it over on the left. And so that was to enable them to be able to perform different behaviors. And each pen had an equal amount of males and females, which enabled us to account for sex differences. And so like I said, all the birds were hatched, vaccinated, and managed the same in this environmentally controlled room. Now, all the strains were fed the same all vegetable antibiotic-free diet. The birds were vaccinated at hatch so that we could use that antibiotic-free diet. Once the birds reached the pre-established market weight that I'll talk about in a minute, a subsample of the birds were euthanized for organ and bone traits, and another subsample of the birds were processed at a provincial processing plant so that we could look at meat and carcass quality. And for the birds that we weren't using for either the organ or meat data, the carcasses were donated to a local food bank, so they weren't discarded. And we processed birds at one of 3 ages. Because we know from other studies that production and welfare parameters can vary depending on the weight of the bird and or the age of the bird, we wanted to make sure that we were comparing both at similar weights and similar ages. And so based on the breeder estimated growth rates, we estimated the age at which either the conventional or the slower growing strains would reach an average light body weight of 2.1 kilogram and a heavier body weight of 3.2 kilograms. And now this was taking into account the fact that we had a large number of strains with slightly different growth rates, but also taking into account that there were limited days on which we could take the birds to the processing plant. So arranging the study in this way allowed us to compare birds at similar body weights at what we called target weights 1 and target weight 2, but also at the same age at 48 days. I mentioned that the birds were processed at a commercial plant. And so in order for them to fit us in, we had to choose the processing dates ahead of time. And so working off the anticipated growth rates, we chose days that worked, of course, with the plant to give us that 2.1 and 3.2 kilograms. While the average birds were those weights, there were differences between categories. So in blue, we have target weight 1, and you can see that the fast and the moderate categories, strains of birds were heavier than that target weight, while the conventional and the slow birds were lighter than that weight. Similarly, at the heavier target weight, at target weight 2, we found differences with the moderate and the slow strains being lighter than the fast strains. There was nothing we could do about this because of logistics, but whenever possible, we did adjust the data relative to the bird's body weight or used body weight as a covariate in our data analyses. Overall, mortality in our study was fairly good for broiler production, 2.5%, and there was no differences in mortality among the different categories. And this value, the overall mortality, and particularly for the conventional strains, was lower than had been reported in other studies. And so this lack of difference may be due to a number of different reasons. Our on-site hatching, incubation and hatching meant that there was no transportation between the hatchery and the farm. We also used an experimental setting with small groups and had no disease pressure. This study ran over a 2-year period, and we didn't have any of the trials necessitating treatment for any diseases, despite having antibiotic-free diets. And we studied the bird's foot and leg health, as they're quite important welfare indicators. And we looked at lesions on both their feet and their legs. We looked at their legs for any deformations. And then we also looked at bone quality and bone strength. We know that severe foot pad lesions and hop burns can be painful for the birds. These lesions also can be an entry point for bacteria, making them a major reason for condemnation or downgrading of carcasses. So on this figure, I have the percent of birds with severe foot pad lesions on the y-axis. and the categories by target weight on the x-axis. And so there was quite a bit of variation, particularly, actually at both target weights, sorry, but there was no difference in the prevalence of severe foot pad lesions at the lighter target weight. We did find at the heavier target weight 2, that the conventional strains had a greater percent of severe foot pad lesions than did the fast strains. However, all of the strains really experienced high levels of foot pad dermatitis, and these are the severe lesions that may cause pain. The poor foot pad conditions really right across the board in our study indicate that it was a challenging environment for all the birds. The pens in our study had solid walls, which reduced the air movement and led to wet litter. Because leg strength has been suggested as being a problem in broiler chickens, we measured the birds' tibia breaking strength. Using an Instron tensile machine, we determined the amount of force in newtons per kilogram of body weight that is necessary to cause a break. And the 2 target weights are on the x-axis here, and the strains in descending order of growth rate. And so we found at target weight 1 that the conventional strains had greater strength, bone breaking strength, than the other 3 strains, with slow being, the other 3 categories, pardon me, with slow being greater than fast and moderate. At target weight 2, we saw similarly that conventional and slow strains had greater strength than the fast and moderate strains. Now, bone strength was recognized as a welfare concern some 25 years or so ago. And it's obvious that the breeding companies have been successful in incorporating this welfare trait into their selection schemes without having a huge effect on growth rate. So there is a precedent for the major breeding companies to include these traits that confer better welfare into their selection schemes. Any study on broiler welfare must quantify lameness. And we know that moderate to severe lameness is painful for the birds, and about 3 to 5% of heavy broilers are unable to walk. And traditionally, lameness is quantified using gait scores. And there's a number of different gait scoring systems, but they generally include normal gait at one end of the spectrum and birds that are unable to walk at the other end of the spectrum. And those 2 are fairly easy to recognize. However, it's the in-between stages that can be a bit difficult, particularly when you're using strains that have naturally different body sizes and shapes and have different temperaments for moving when approached by people. So we looked into the literature for some of the alternatives to examine lameness and mobility. And so one of the alternative tests that we used, it was the latency to lie test. And Claire Weeks first described this some 20 years ago. And she found that the test corresponded with results of traditional gait scoring, meaning that it's a validated test of lameness. And so in this test, the birds were placed into a container of shallow, warm water. And in this case, we used 2 birds that were separated by a mesh barrier so that they could still have social contact with one of their pen mates. So we put them in this, video recorded them for 10 minutes, and we measured the bird's latency to lie down in the water as a proxy for their stamina and their leg strength. And so here are the results of the latency to lie test at the 2 target weights. On the y-axis is time. Maximum amount of time they could stand was 10 minutes. And the results are quite different depending on the target weight. At the first target weight, the conventional strains and the slowest strains had the longest latencies to lie, longer than the fast and moderate strains. And this was unexpected, but it does follow exactly the trend in body weight at this target weight, with the conventional and the slow strains being lighter than the fast and the moderate strains. Now at target weight 2, the latency to lie increased with decreasing growth rates. So the slow strains stood for longer than the conventional and the fast strains. When we considered both of those target weights together, the conventional strains in the darkest blue had shorter latencies to lie with increasing time, whereas the other strains did not differ from target weight 1 to target weight 2 in their ability to support their body weight. And so a shorter latency to lie means that the birds either were unable or unwilling to remain standing. An inability to remain standing may reflect either painfulness during standing. Certainly one study found that administration of an NSAID increased the latencies to lie in broilers. It may also reflect poor physical fitness for strenuous activity. Alternatively, birds may have been unwilling to remain standing. So there may be differences in temperament or response to being in the warm water that would have been captured by these results. But we found very few differences when we looked between strains within categories. And so because this test isn't something that chickens would have been exposed to during selection, we wouldn't have expected that the differences in aversion to water per se to co-vary with either body weights or growth rates. The second lameness or mobility test that we used is the group obstacle test. And this test was first described by Gina Kaplan, and through it we're able to quantify birds' mobility within their home pen. So if birds are lame, they may or may not be in pain, depending on the cause of their lameness. However, they may experience frustration if they're unable to access food and water or other important resources. And so this test has also been validated with traditional gait scoring to indicate lameness. In this test, birds are in their home pen. The various colors, we painted them. That's not, we do not have any blue broilers in our study or pink ones, but those were painted for identification purposes. And so the birds were fasted for 1 hour prior to the study. And then we put this wooden obstacle, it was 10 centimeters high, in between their drinker and their feeder. After that was after the hour of fasting. Then we put the feed back and released the birds from holding at the back of the pen, just while we were putting in the obstacle. And then we video recorded them for 5 hours. So we counted the number of times birds crossed that obstacle for 5 hours with their feed on this end and the drinker line on the other end. And so on here, this shows the results of the obstacle test in the number of crossings over a 5-hour period. At the lighter target weight, we didn't see any statistical difference between the categories. The average bird crossed the obstacle about 9 times over the course of 5 hours. At the second target weight, there was a significant difference between categories in that the slow strains crossed more often than the conventional or the fast strains. And similar to the latency to lie test, fewer obstacle crossings could indicate either an unwillingness or an inability to cross the obstacle. As broilers are selected based partly on feed intake, we would expect all of them to have a need to eat within that 5-hour window. However, the added obstacle meant that perhaps some larger birds crossed less often, either because they couldn't or because they didn't want to. Since we couldn't watch birds for 24 hours a day, but we wanted to know what was going on with their activity levels, we used triaxial data loggers or Actical data loggers on the birds. And these are basically chicken Fitbits, if you will. And we've attached them to the back of the birds using like a backpack strapping when the birds were 21 days of age, and we kept those on until the end of the experiment. And this data logger has been validated for inactivity levels in laying hens. And the bottom graph is just an actogram of one bird at 25 days of age over a 12-hour period. And I denoted when the lights went on in red here. So you can clearly see the change in activity with the lights on. Birds are more active, of course, during daytime hours. On this graph, we have the inactivity levels of birds from 4 to 9 weeks of age. And the duration of time inactive over the 24-hour period is on the y-axis. And for all the categories, inactivity increased with age. However, the conventional birds were more inactive than the slow and the moderate strains at 4 weeks of age, and this difference amounted to about 2 hours of increased inactivity. At 5 weeks of age, the conventional strains were more inactive than the slowest strains by about 1 hour per day. Now, the conventional strains also reached their maximum level of inactivity earlier than the other strains. However, that said, all of the strains reached a similar level of inactivity over the course of the study. Now, inactivity levels don't tell us really anything about a bird's welfare. We need to determine if birds are not active because they can't or because they don't want to be. And that will, for us, in order to understand the welfare implications of it. So it could be that the inactivity corresponds with poor physical fitness or cardiovascular fitness, or the differences could reflect selection for decreased activity. That said, inactivity levels themselves can lead to other welfare concerns if birds are having increased contact with wet litter, or they are not getting as much load-bearing exercise as is needed. In order to better understand the implications of the differences in behavior, we looked at the body conformation of the different strains. On the left side is the relative tibia length of broilers at the heavier target weight. And so what we found was that as the growth rate increased from slow to conventional, the length of the tibia decreased. And this is accounting for the body weight. So for the same body weight, conventional had shorter legs than the remaining categories. At the same time, on the right, we have relative breast weight accounting for the body weight of the birds. So as growth rate increased, we saw an increase in breast weight. So the conventional strains had large breasts and short legs. And this may influence their locomotor activity, since their center of gravity would have been moved more cranially than other strains of birds. Having short legs would help them control their lateral movement, but it would also lead to inefficient activity. So that inefficiency could then perhaps lead to lower levels of activity to compensate for the greater energy demands. So to summarize the results, we did find that many of the welfare outcomes were related to growth rates, in particular, the inactivity levels and mobility. We also found that there were few consistent differences between strains within categories. That indicates that selection for growth concurrently selected for a number of traits that confer differences in welfare. However, broilers are often criticized for being inactive, but we found that even the slowest growing strains spent 17 to 19 hours inactive and experienced severe foot pad lesions. So just slowing down the growth rates on their own will not necessarily lead to perfect welfare. Now, birds' willingness or ability to stand in water and cross an obstacle corresponded with their weight and growth rate, depending on the time that we did it. The results were not due to bone strength, as conventional strains had the strongest tibia, but also had worse mobility. But because the conventional strains had the largest breasts and the shortest legs, I also didn't present, but they also had the smallest lungs. The differences may reflect differences either in their center of gravity or in their cardiovascular fitness. There were some positive messages for all of the strains, in that we found really very little evidence of bone strength problems, long bone deformations, or ascites, which is a buildup of fluid in the abdominal cavity that can lead to heart failure. And these problems, I think, were more prevalent some 25 or so years ago, and they were identified, so then breeding companies were able to successfully incorporate them into their breeding programs. Now, I didn't present the individual strain data today, but we did find some differences between strains of similar growth rates in some of the traits, which indicates that there's potential for selection for improved welfare outcomes with minimal impact on the growth rate. Now, I talked a lot about broilers, but there's another fairly major consideration that needs to be considered when looking at slower growing broilers, and that's their parent stock, the broiler breeders. Broiler breeders produce about 150 broiler chicks per hen. And so in order to supply the huge number of broilers that are consumed each year, there's about 60 million breeder hens that are in production each year. And broiler breeders are in production for about a year, so until they reach about 60 to 70 weeks of age. And they're feed restricted from about 2 weeks of age. So they're feed restricted because they have a similar growth potential as their broiler chicken that have been selected for fast growth and a large appetite. However, if broiler breeders are allowed to eat to satiety, they quickly become obese and develop all the health and fertility issues related to obesity. So really high mortality, inability to walk, things like that. So they are feed restricted at times quite severely to ensure that they're not experiencing obesity, but as a result, they experience chronic hunger. And they experience that for greater than a year. As a result of that chronic hunger, they develop things like feather pecking, poor feather coverage as a result of the feather pecking. They drink excessively, which uses a lot of water. And my team and I did quite a bit of work over a decade into feed restriction for conventional broiler breeders and chronic hunger. And through our studies, we found that you can make small improvements by bulking up the diet or changing feed management, but conventional broiler breeders are still chronically hungry. And nutritional strategies for them are Band-Aid solutions at best. So as part of this study, we had the really great opportunity to study 3 slower growing broiler breeder female lines. As I said, my team had studied conventional broiler breeders for a dozen years. So we used the same housing and conditions for the slower growing strains as we did in previous studies for the conventional lines, so that we could hopefully understand if there were a lot of differences among strains. And we tested both the conventional broiler breeders in blue and the 3 slower strains in reds and oranges using a feed intake motivation test. So in this test, we measured how much feed the hens would eat relative to their body weight when they were given ad libitum access to feed over a predetermined amount of time. So our studies with conventional broiler breeders, for example, here on the left, routinely showed that the conventional breeds would consume about 1.5% to 2% of their body weight during this test. Meanwhile, the slower growing strains would consume about a half or a third of their body weight. In addition to this, we also quantified water usage. We hadn't done that in previous studies, but certainly as we consider the environmental footprint of slower growing strains, we wanted to see whether there could be any compensatory gains, not in weight, but in less water usage. And we did find that the slower growing strains used about a third less water at a similar or higher egg production rate. Now, our paper on laying performance is still forthcoming, but I think it certainly points to the need for more research into the welfare implications of slower growing strains for broiler breeders. But there's also other ways in which we can influence broiler welfare that's beyond their genetics. Certainly the Better Chicken Commitment, which is a proposal to improve welfare put out by a number of the advocacy groups, includes areas to improve welfare, including things like, of course, genetics, but the use of enrichment, lowering stocking density, and using more humane methods of stunning. But there's also nutritional ways that we can use to improve broilers' robustness and help them to cope with the stressors of production. Finally, I do want to acknowledge that people value different things. I'm speaking to you as someone trained in animal welfare science. However, in addition to welfare, the discussion around slower growing broiler production needs to also consider the environmental footprint, the global human population, food prices, antibiotic use, and zoonotic diseases. So Dick Julian, who some of you may know as a emeritus faculty at Guelph, who advised us a little bit on the start of our experiment, suggested some 20 years ago that it wasn't rapid growth alone that's related to the defects. And we hope that our results will enable not only the various stakeholders to evaluate breeds of broilers and determine which ones can meet their criteria, but more importantly, we hope that our data leads to advances in broiler welfare through the incorporation of additional welfare traits within selection schemes. I want to acknowledge our funders, Global Animal Partnership, the Canada First Research Excellence Fund through the Food from Thought program, the Ontario Agri-Food Alliance, and the anonymous breeding companies and other organizations that supported us. And in addition to the people that I mentioned at the start, this project was huge and included really a lot of work and people and brain power. And so I just want to put these names out there and say thank you for all of the work that you did in making this project a success. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. So I think if you're unmuted, you can really clap. Otherwise, use your reaction thing and your yellow hands to thanks, Steph, for a fantastic presentation. The logistic complexity of this vast project blows me away, and it's so amazing to see it all pulled together.